Good evening, Mr. President. President of AIPS. Good evening, Kwabena Yeboah, my old friend from football. Look, ladies and gentlemen, you probably don't realize it, but Kwabena, who's always smiling here, is the reason for a lot of my suffering. I'm telling you, he is. Yeah. It may be difficult to understand, but for me, who decided to live a certain type of life, I was responsible for bringing in DSTV into Ghana and into other places in West Africa. I run my own global businesses with Motorola and such like from a distance, very quietly. And just living a nice little quiet life, doing what it is I wanted to do. Kwabena then started a campaign that eventually brought me to Kumasi Asante Kotoko. I tried saying, I don't know too much about football, but everybody knows something about football. But Kwabena persisted. And eventually I got dragged into running Kumasi Asante Kotoko for 4 good years, or there and thereabouts. And I love it. So Kwabena, I do have to thank you. I think my family are not happy with you because, millions of dollars later, we've had to move on. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, my foray into football was initially due to Kwabena. I remember we went up to Kumasi, Kwabena Yeboah, myself, and a gentleman called Mr. Whelan, who apparently was affiliated with Manchester United setup. We had met in South Africa with Sepp Blatter, now the infamous Sepp Blatter. I'm not sure if you're allowed to mention his name at all. But I managed to get Gary Bailey, the extraordinary goalkeeper from Manchester United, to interview him and to talk about him. And I believed that his tendency would be good for Africa at the time. I believed in some of the things that he had passed on through third parties to me. And we had made that arrangement. We met. Thereafter, I came to Ghana with Kwabena, with Mr. Whelan and a couple of others, actually determined to keep away from football. Not because I didn't like it. I think football is an extraordinary sport, but simply because I'm one of those people who, when you ask me to do something, I want to either do it well or not do it at all. And I believe there's a global standard. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, a global standard. And that global standard says, how are things done globally and how can we do it better? Because Allah, the God Almighty above, has graced us with so many things. And one is with people who are naturally athletic and balanced, and who have the ability, if the right circumstances are given, for them to achieve nearly anything on earth. So that was the background. And 4 good years at Kotoko are years that I will never regret. So Kwabena, I do say thank you on one side. And on the other side, I have to blame you for having got me into football in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues, all protocols observed, I'm here today to talk a couple of minutes about rugby. Rugby is the 2nd largest sport in the world, and I think it is actually the greatest sport in the world. And that's just coming from a gentleman who not only played rugby, I'm lucky to have played for Saracens in the UK before. I played Mashonaland in Zimbabwe, for old Hererians in Zimbabwe. I've captained the Ghana rugby team. I played rugby in France and in different places. But I've also been involved with athletics. As a young man, I won the Victor Ludorium at school for running 100 meters. So even at my size, at 120 kilos, I was running 100 meters in less than 11 seconds. Long jump and getting on for 6 meters as a young man, 16 years old. Triple jump as well, and 200 meters. So having done that, I have a huge interest in athletics. But having grown up around different parts of the world, I'm into all sports. So somebody says, can you swim? I said, yes, I was taught swimming at the age of 6, etc., etc. And why do I mention this? Because at the core of a lot of problems of sports development in Africa is that our core strength as athletes within Africa is not strong enough. We don't have enough transport, which means that in school we play football or nothing. But for those who are lucky enough to have played hockey and football and rugby and cricket and volleyball, use different body parts for strength, for balance, for strength in terms of moving on. And that's what fundamentally makes a difference in terms of where you're going. There's also a global approach to sport. So how it is that we eat, we prepare ourselves, we train, we live, mental preparation is something that there's a new global standard for sports. It's not just about participating anymore. And that's something I believe very, very strongly with. Now, Africa Rugby, ladies and gentlemen, was established in 1986 by Aziz Bouja, recent past president. He served his time and he can no longer run. But he set it up with a little group of friends. Guidel from Senegal, who's an extraordinary gentleman. Marcelin, who spends a lot of his time in Ghana, from the Ivory Coast. Khalid Babou, who is the current president of Africa Rugby, and a couple of others as well, all got involved in the process. They established it, affiliated themselves to World Rugby, and have tried to make it grow. Africa is huge, though. Culturally, huge. Geographically, huge. Climatically, different. And given the fact that there is a lack of money that's being prepared to spend in the second largest sport in the world, the challenge has always been massive. Always been massive. And over the years, it's changed. And I'm sure that a lot of you in the audience here who are involved in football administration or sports administration are crying out because of lack of sponsorship and money. And if you are, you can imagine what it's like for the rest of us. But in rugby, they developed it all the way down the line. And I got involved in Ghana Rugby 4 years ago. We became World Rugby members 2-3 years later in rapid, very quick time. And we've sought to develop. And it's reached a point where we do need to move to another level. In Ghana, we've taken the models of World Rugby, which, ladies and gentlemen, I always say that if football could adopt some of the measures that we do in rugby, football would be far ahead. I say this because we have a Getting Into Rugby program. Here in Ghana, we have over 4,000 children that we are training in schools in terms of rugby. It's not the physical contact aspect, but it is almost like touch rugby, fun rugby, that gives you a discipline, a balance, a sense of teamwork, a sense of respect, and everything that rugby is about. If you approach the same approach for football, so don't just say go play football or pass, kick, but you actually got into the technical aspects, which is what we're doing with rugby, you can imagine that we'd have an Ajax-style level of technical expertise in terms of football in general. Rugby has shown me things that were a little bit absent when I was involved in football. The issues of administrative integrity, governance, compliance, and other things that you're mandated to follow. The transparency that goes with it, the amendment of the Constitution, and the way that we run rugby is a lesson for all sports, I believe. And we need to work. But in terms of rugby, we have a dream, and that is that we could all work together. I would love to work closer with the footballers, because I think that if football administration would look at how we run the game, we could come together. I believe we'd raise more money for us and more money for football as well, in terms of taking ourselves forward. I've looked at how we're blessed. When you look at the way that the Kenyan rugby players play sevens at the moment, when they're not bickering and they're full strength, they can beat anybody. And I believe that we can do that as well with the longer extension of the game that takes us into the World Cup this year. This year we have the World Cup in Tokyo, of which Africa will be represented by South Africa, which is no surprise, and Namibia. In the past, Ivory Coast have represented Africa as well. We have 2 slots, that's only, for this massive continent. And we have to fight for more. And I think Khalid Babou will do that as part of his agenda as being president of Africa Rugby. But we ourselves have got to show that we can play better. We can organize competitions better. We can develop it within the continent of Africa. I've always had a dream that we should look, because of our sheer size, and break it up into 4 or 5 economic groups. So if you take Africa West or Africa West and Central, that becomes a group where we try and raise money, and then you set up our own Super League, and you set up different things that represent that will take us to another point. And then we get into, as I said, the World Cup. This year I will go. Sadly, Ghana will not be there. No West African team will be there. No truly black African team will be there. It'll be South Africa, which has a lot of black players and represents black Africa and Africa. It is multicultural, black, white, and everything else, and we'll be supporting them. Namibia, which is pretty much the same. But there'll come a time where we'd like to see countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and other teams also at the World Cup. We require planning. investment money, etc. But when I go to Tokyo, I'll not only be watching rugby, I'll be looking at how it's organized. We can all learn. I'll be looking at which are the main sponsors who are there and see which ones maybe we can encourage Africa Rugby to extend an arm to. Because the world has changed. When I was involved in football, we pioneered investments in football in a way that was being done, I would like to think, ahead of most of the continent of Africa. But in terms of rugby, is to go and see if there are 500 or 1,000 sponsors. There must be ways in which we can approach. Sponsor fatigue means that you can no longer go to people and say, give me, and then we say thank you afterwards. We really have got to get into what will make the corporate world continue its marriage of sports and be prepared to manage into Africa, because we have major challenges. When you go seeking funding, you may see large organizations that will give to the global world, but they will not give to Africa. And yet it is they want to sell their products within Africa. There has to be something wrong with that. And we therefore have to address these challenges at many different levels. And that's why we need to work together. Rugby, football, government, etc. And find out what we can give back to those organizations that we can take ourselves to another point. But as I finish off, let me stop talking about rugby and talk about youth. AIPS, I think you're doing an extraordinary job. It's all about how it is that we generate information about ourselves, manage our reality, and ensure that it is our story that is to be told. Not the story as put together by global media, but from yourself. And therefore it starts with us asking you to better appreciate that some of us, if you go to parts of Sudan, are getting on for 7 foot tall. And there are others in Central Africa who may be 4 foot tall. We're all different. That's the point I'm making. Different levels of stamina, different shades of brown, black, whatever. Different abilities to run fast, jump further, jump higher. And we therefore need to understand that we can't all play football. We may be better at handball, volleyball, basketball. But rugby is the second largest sport in the world. And I just say, embrace us, learn from us, tell our story so that we can take on the world. Because we can't take on the world in silence. We can only take it with your support. Mr. President, thank you for having me. Mr. President, my dear friend and troublemaker, Kwabena Yeboah, thank you for having me here as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Congratulations.